My son's teacher has been giving him some strange homework. His latest assignment was horrifying. I'm not a massive fan of homework, but it seemed like the homework that Mrs. Wagner always set quite simple tasks that could easily be completed in a night for the most part. Initially, Dylan had to ask a parent and find out what their parents did for work and ask 3 questions about their job. But as time went on, I started to get scared. The homework began to get a little more personal. Every night, I would ask Dylan what his homework was for that night, and then I would help him with it if he needed help. That's when I noticed the homework becoming a little bit strange. One night, on Dylan's 3rd week of being in the new class, he came home looking upset. I asked him, when he entered the kitchen, what was wrong, and he told me that everything was okay. I could tell, though, that something was wrong, but he didn't want to tell me. Dylan spent most of the night in his room. We decided to let him stay there for a while, but after an hour or two, I went in to see him and let him know that it was time to go to bed. I walked down to his room, opened the door, and when I looked inside, I saw that he had already fallen asleep over his workbook. I quietly walked over to him to gently wake him up and move him to his bed, but that's when I saw it. The homework task that was set for that night. The title that was written in Dylan's workbook was, "Would I miss my parents if I no longer lived with them?" At first, I was taken aback. This was a very weird task to set for a group of 14 and 15-year-olds. I didn't really know how to react to this. I continued to read, though, to see what else he had written. He had written, "I would miss both my mom and dad very much. I love them both a lot, and they help me with everything. I love spending dinner time with them, but I would probably love someone else as much as them if I had to, like you were saying today, Mrs. Wagner." When I read the final sentence, I felt chills down my spine. The words struck me like a brick to the face. What had Mrs. Wagner been telling my son? What was the purpose of telling him these things? I decided, probably stupidly, not to tell my wife about what I had found. She would worry, and she probably had a right to worry, but I didn't want to concern her. I decided that I would instead confront Mrs. Wagner tomorrow and ask her about this strange homework task. The next day, I took Dylan to school like I normally do, except this time I got out and walked up to the classroom with him. I saw Mrs. Wagner alone in the classroom as I entered the room, and she greeted me with a smile. "Hey, how are you?" she said as I entered the classroom. "How is Dylan settling in?" She was dressed in a flannel skirt with a black jacket, and her brown hair was slightly curled. I answered that he was settling in well, but I did have 1 or 2 concerns. She asked what they were, and so I explained. "I was just curious about the homework you set yesterday, the one about how much they would miss their parents. I am just concerned because it is a very strange and confronting thing to ask a group of 9th graders. I also noticed that Dylan wrote that he might have to love someone else if he had to, like you told him. I would really like you to explain that," I asked her, quite bluntly. "Oh, that," she replied as she let out a slight laugh. "Yesterday I was teaching about how parents love and protect their kids, but also how that there are also other people that would be there to help them if they need it." I wasn't satisfied with this answer and was about to question her further, when suddenly a large group of school children entered the classroom. They were all walking in 2 rows. They all greeted Mrs. Wagner and greeted her one by one. They seemed very well behaved, almost too well behaved. I then saw Dylan take a seat next to one of the students, who was staring to the front of the classroom with their arms crossed. At the entrance of the rest of the class, Dylan's behavior seemed to change. He seemed to sit up a bit straighter, and his eyes widened as he began staring at the rest of the class. I looked around and noticed that all of the students were staring at the same spot. All their eyes were pointed at Mrs. Wagner. Something didn't feel right, but I knew that Dylan needed to stay at school, and this was probably some sort of morning routine they had. I decided that I would pick Dylan up from school, though, and so I left work a little bit early and drove over to the school. When the bell rang, most of the kids came running and screaming out of the gate, apart from Mrs. Wagner's class. They all walked out in a line, walking in time. This disturbed me. I had never seen a group of students so well behaved, especially even after the school bell had rung. Dylan walked over to the car and hopped in. He didn't say anything and sat in his seat, staring straight forward. I asked him if he was okay, and he just gave me a blunt response, almost instantly. Yes. I drove him home in silence, and when we got home and inside, Dylan went straight to his room and closed the door. I knew something was definitely wrong, but I didn't know what. I decided to leave him alone until my wife got home, and I would tell her everything that had been going on. She got home about half an hour later, and I sat her down and explained everything that had been going on. She sat and listened, and started to look more and more worried with every word I said. Maybe I should go and talk to him. He might like that, she said once I had finished explaining everything. I agreed, and so she went into his room, and I waited out in the lounge room for them to finish talking to each other. 15 minutes later, Dylan walked out of his room and into the lounge room. He was holding a small workbook, and he said, "Can you help me with my homework, Dad?" "Of course. Come and show me what you need help with," I replied. He held out the notebook, and I took it out of his hands and read the homework task for tonight. Written on the top line of the page was one task: research the best way to inject your parents with anesthetic. I barely finished reading the sentence when I felt the sharp pain in my neck, and I looked down and saw the needle sticking out of the side of my neck. Dylan was holding the other end of the needle, a blank stare on his face. Everything started to go black, and the last thing I remember seeing is Dylan staring down at me as I lay on the floor. I don't know how long I was out, but I was awoken by my wife screaming and crying. I woke up startled as she continued to scream. "He's gone. Dylan's gone." She kept screaming. I looked up at her, and the first thing I saw was the small pin prick that was on the side of her neck. She had been injected too. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to find my son. I tried my best to get up, but I think the drug hadn't properly worn off yet because I still couldn't move properly. I could move my arms, so I managed to get my phone out of my pocket and dial the police. I explained to them what had happened, and they said that they would send officers out and would begin looking for Dylan. I then noticed that it was already 9 in the morning, and so I decided to ring the school and see if Dylan had gone there. I dialed, and a lady answered the phone. I asked if she had seen Dylan from Mrs. Wagner's class. "No, I am very sorry, but we haven't seen him today. In fact, we haven't seen anyone from Mrs. Wagner's class today. They are all absent," which is very odd. Because Mrs. Wagner hasn't shown up for work either today, the lady on the phone said. I hung up and sat in silence for a moment. My wife had heard what the lady said, so she also just sat there in total silence. That was all 3 weeks ago, and Dylan is still missing, along with Mrs. Wagner and the rest of his classmates. All the parents of the kids in Dylan's class have the same story. They were injected with something by their own children, and when they woke up, their child was gone. No one knows where they went, but we all had the same questions. Were they all together? Was Mrs. Wagner with them? Was this all planned? Exactly a month after the kids disappeared, the parents of Dylan's classmates and I gathered for a meeting at the town hall. We needed to share our experiences, our fears, our guilt. But as we were sharing our stories, one parent, Mrs. Johnson, whose son was also in Mrs. Wagner's class, remembered a strange detail. Mrs. Wagner had often spoken about a cabin her family owned deep in the woods, about 50 miles north of town. The police had searched her home and nearby areas, but nobody thought to check the cabin. Armed with this new information, we immediately called the police and relayed the information. They promised to launch a search the next morning and advised us to stay home for our safety. We couldn't just sit and wait, though. A few of the other parents and I decided to take matters into our hands. We gathered flashlights, maps, and a few essentials, and in the dead of the night, drove towards the woods. We navigated the dense forest for hours, the silence broken only by the sound of rustling leaves in our pounding hearts. As the sun began to rise, we came across an old, dilapidated cabin. The windows were boarded up and the paint was peeling off, but it was still standing. My heart pounded in my chest as we approached the cabin. We called for our kids, praying they would hear us and respond. Instead, what greeted us was an eerie silence. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the creaking door of the cabin. What we found inside was beyond our worst nightmares. The cabin was empty, but the walls were covered in scribbled writing and drawings that looked like they were done by children. A detailed plan was sketched out on one wall, outlining a strategy for the children to inject their parents and make their way to the cabin. The plan was signed with Mrs. Wagner's name. As we frantically scanned the room, something else caught our attention. A stack of notebooks lay on a dusty table. The cover of each notebook had a child's name, the names of all the missing children from Mrs. Wagner's class. I picked up Dylan's notebook, my hands shaking. I flipped through the pages, filled with more strange homework assignments, notes, and ramblings that seemed to be instructions from Mrs. Wagner. The last page stopped my heart. It was a drawing made by Dylan. It showed all the children, including him, standing hand in hand with Mrs. Wagner. They were standing at the edge of what seemed like a cliff, all smiling. And under the drawing, Dylan had written one chilling line: how to eliminate your family, including yourself.